It was nighttime. Ajit and his friend Rohan had ventured into a dense forest near New York. The forest was notorious for its eerie history, but Ajit and Rohan dismissed it as mere rumors. They were seeking peace and a bit of adventure, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. As soon as they entered the forest, they felt an unusual stillness. No birds chirping, no rustling of leaves. Everything was unnaturally quiet. As they walked, they came across an old, dilapidated cabin. Seeing the cabin, Ajit joked, "Looks like this is where the ghosts live." Rohan laughed and replied, "Don't be a scaredy cat. These are just stories." But as they were about to step inside the cabin, a sudden gust of cold wind blew and the door slammed shut on its own. They looked at each other in surprise but shrugged it off as a coincidence. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was strange. The walls were adorned with old, faded pictures. One particular picture caught Ajit's eye, a family portrait, but something about it was odd. The eyes of all the family members were unnaturally red. Ajit pointed this out to Rohan. Rohan, still in a light-hearted mood, said, "Maybe the artist used too much red paint." But Ajit couldn't shake off the eerie feeling creeping up inside him. Suddenly they heard footsteps approaching. The sound grew louder and louder. They looked at each other, realizing they were not alone. Just then, a strange shadow appeared at the door of the cabin. Ajit and Rohan were stunned to see the strange shadow at the door of the cabin. Their hearts started pounding. Ajit whispered to Rohan, "This isn't a joke, Rohan. We need to get out of here." But Rohan, still taking the situation lightly, said, "Relax, let's check it out first." Rohan bravely walked to the door and slowly opened it. He shined his flashlight outside, but to Ajit's surprise, there was no one there, just empty darkness. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," Rohan said with a smile. But as soon as he turned around, the shadow reappeared on the door. This time, the shadow was clearer, a tall man with glowing eyes and a distinct silhouette. Ajit grabbed Rohan's arm and said, "This place isn't right, we need to leave now." But Rohan shook him off and said, "You're too scared. It's probably just the shadow of an animal." Now thoroughly spooked, Ajit had countless questions swirling in his mind. He just wanted to leave the place as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the candle inside the cabin flickered wildly and then went out. Darkness engulfed them. Ajit and Rohan couldn't see a thing. But Ajit could feel something. The shadow was now very close. He could feel its cold breath on his neck. Ajit's courage broke. Without thinking, he grabbed Rohan's hand and ran out of the cabin. They sprinted out, but strangely, the cabin door slammed shut behind them, and they found themselves back at the edge of the forest where they had started. Rohan was completely silent now. He couldn't comprehend what was happening. They looked at each other and decided they would run out of the forest as fast as they could. But as they started to run, they heard the sound of something rushing towards them. They ran faster, but the sound kept getting closer. And suddenly Ajit realized that the shadow was no longer behind them. It was standing in front of them, blocking their way. Ajit and Rohan stood frozen as the shadow blocked their path. The shadow was now fully visible, taking the form of an old man with a wrinkled face and unnaturally glowing red eyes. Rohan looked at Ajit and muttered, This isn't human." Ajit's heart was pounding in his throat. They realized they were in serious danger. The old man began to move slowly towards them. His movements were unnerving. He didn't move like a person, but like a shadow creeping across the ground. Gathering his courage, Ajit asked the old man, "Who are you? What do you want from us?" In a cold, heavy voice, the old man replied, "You've made a grave mistake by coming here. This forest won't let you leave alive." The fear and mystery in his voice sent chills down Ajit and Rohan's spines. Rohan, trying to stay brave, asked, "But what have we done?" "Just let us go." The old man laughed a creaky, chilling laugh that echoed like an old door groaning open. "Once the forest catches you, it never lets you go. Those who enter here are lost forever, and now so are you." Suddenly, the old man's face twisted into a horrific grin. Blood started oozing from his eyes and his form became blurry, spreading out like smoke around them. They were surrounded. The shadow had spread all around them. merging with the forest air. Desperate, Ajit noticed something on the ground. There was an inscription in an ancient language. He couldn't understand it, but felt a strange pull towards it. He placed his hand on it, and suddenly, the ground began to shake. Rohan, now terrified, pulled Ajit back, but it was too late. With a loud rumble, something emerged from beneath the ground, an old dusty book. Ajit picked up the book, and as he opened the first page, a bright light filled the forest. The shadow screamed and recoiled, as if it feared the light. Words were written on the pages of the book, but Ajit couldn't understand them. Still, he held onto the book tightly, trying to read. As the light grew brighter, the shadow began to fade. The old man's screams echoed through the forest, and finally, he vanished into the darkness. Ajit and Rohan fell to the ground, gasping for breath. The light began to fade, and the forest around them returned to normal. They didn't know what had just happened, but one thing was clear. This forest and that shadow were no ordinary things. And that book, perhaps it held the key to everything. But as Rohan reached for the book, it suddenly closed on its own, and all the writing on it disappeared. Ajit and Rohan decided it was time to leave the forest as quickly as possible. But as they stood up, they realized that the forest path had become even more complicated. Would they be able to escape this dangerous forest? Would the book continue to haunt them? Or would they encounter something even more terrifying? Ajit and Rohan knew they had to escape this terrifying forest, but it was no ordinary place, and leaving it was going to be a huge challenge. As they continued deeper into the forest, the paths kept shifting. Trees that had once stood in a straight line now seemed dense and tangled. The air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread surrounded them. Suddenly, they came across a small, dark pond. The water was pitch black, and ripples disturbed its surface, as if something beneath was trying to emerge. Ajit warned Rohan, "We shouldn't go near that water. It could be just as dangerous as the shadow." But Rohan, exhausted and desperate, sat down by the edge of the pond. He leaned closer to the water, saying, "Maybe there's a clue here, something that can help us escape." As soon as Rohan touched the water, a hand shot out from the depths, grabbing his arm. Rohan screamed as the hand began pulling him toward the water's depths. Ajit quickly grabbed Rohan's other arm, pulling with all his might, but the grip of the hand was terrifyingly strong. Using every ounce of strength, Ajit managed to pull Rohan free from the hand's grasp. The two of them bolted away from the pond, running deeper into the forest. As they ran, they stumbled upon an old, decrepit temple. The doors were wide open, and a faint light was emanating from inside. Desperate for answers, they headed toward the temple, hoping it might be their last hope. Inside the temple, they found a statue surrounded by a few flickering candles. An old sage was seated in front of the statue, his eyes closed in meditation. He looked ancient and weary, as though he had been there for centuries. Ajit, mustering all his courage, asked the sage, "Baba, please help us. This forest is trying to trap us. How can we escape?" The sage slowly opened his eyes and said, "Your arrival here was destined. This forest doesn't easily release those it captures, but there may be a way out this time." The sage showed them the old book that Ajit had found earlier. "This book," he said, "holds the key to your fate. It contains the story of the spirit that cursed this forest. You must take this book to the heart of the forest, beneath the ancient tree, and burn it. Only then can you break free from this curse." Ajit and Rohan knew they had no other choice. Taking the book, they ventured deeper into the forest until they found the ancient tree. The tree was massive, its roots sprawling in all directions, and it exuded an ominous presence. They placed the book beneath the tree and lit it on fire with one of the candles. As the book caught fire, the forest was engulfed in a powerful wind, and the shadowy figure began to emerge once again. The shadow, now fully formed, screamed in rage, "You cannot leave this forest. It is my domain, and you are trapped here forever." But the flames from the burning book grew stronger, and the shadow began to weaken. It shrieked in pain as it slowly started to disintegrate into nothingness. The forest, which had been so menacing, began to return to its natural state. The trees no longer seemed threatening, and the path out of the forest became clear. Exhausted but relieved, Ajit and Rohan walked out of the forest. Realizing they had survived a harrowing ordeal, as they emerged into the daylight, they turned around to see the forest, but it was no longer there. The place where the forest had stood was now an empty field. They looked at each other, knowing they had experienced something that would stay with them forever. The forest and its shadow were gone, but the memory of their terrifying adventure would never fade. This was their final encounter with the mysterious shadow that would haunt them no more.